Okay, so go ahead. Just a sec. I have to stop the sharing. I have to turn on my video. So Judit, hello the hanguma. Okay, good. Now, is say something with yours to make sure that we can hear
you. Can you hear me?
Okay, that's perfect. Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm gonna do a very quick introduction using your file.
Should I test screen share?
Oh, it's a good idea. Go ahead.
Okay. Should be able to see my screen now.
That's perfect. Okay. So are there any audio or video clips in there?
I shared sound. I do have sound.
Okay. Could you try the sound part to see if it works?
Let's see. But now you see. Okay, here we go. It's very faint. It's meant to be very faint.
Okay, so that's okay. Great. Okay. Then the only other thing I need to do is get your bio. All for say, just an empty formality. Judith, okay, welcome. Judith Gervain is a professor of developmental and social psychology at the University of Padua and also in France. Where?
Yes, right.
Where
at the CNRS.
CNRS, okay. Her research is on early speech perception and language acquisition in monolingual and bilingual infants. She's using behavioral and brain imaging techniques. She has done pioneering work in newborn speech perception using near-infrared spectroscopy. Are you going to talk about any of that?
Yeah.
Okay. Revealing the impact of prenatal experience on early perceptual abilities, and has been one of the first to document the beginnings of the acquisition of grammar in newborns and preverbal infants. And she's born in the same country that I'm born in, Hungary. Go ahead, Judith.
Yes, that's right. So, well, thank you very much for having me, István. Special thanks for organizing this. It's been amazing. I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussions. So indeed, I'm going to talk about development. So today is a developmental day. And so yesterday, and I'm guessing for the rest of the summer school, there's going to be a lot of talking about sort of the shiny, ready, beautiful, fancy models as they are after training. So they're with their architecture, with the training, with the learning they've done. And so we are trying to understand whether these models could be used as models or could be used for understanding human knowledge, the human mind. Are they human-like? Do they learn? Do they use language in a human-like fashion? So this, is, of course, is our big question. And just like in adults, in a full model, once it's trained, it's hard to tease apart what's in the architecture, what's in the training, what's maybe some kind of unforeseen interaction between these two. And so in studying humans, human language, of course, the approach that one approach that you can take to better understand these questions is to look at development, right? So, of course, children are interesting in and of their own, but also looking at development and looking at how children learn and grow and develop also gives us some kind of understanding of what is it that humans bring to any task, say learning language, and what is it that they can learn from the environment, from their experiences. So it kind of allows us to tease apart these factors, or at least see how they interact. And so what I'm going to try to highlight today is this kind of developmental perspective when we think about or look at large language models. So essentially, the question would be whether they learn in a human-like way at all. Of course, you could arrive at human-like knowledge at the end, even if you learned in a different manner. So this question is not deterministic with respect to the previous question, but it's still, of course, informative and suggestive if we find, for example, that they learn in very similar ways to humans, or if we find that they learn in very different ways. And so one thing that was discussed yesterday, and of course, this is what most people know about these models and how they are trained, is that they need a lot of data for their training, right? And the more they get, the better their performance is. So this is of course, interesting. And as it was discussed yesterday, that might be just, how to say, a small detail. And with newer models in the future, maybe in a few months, maybe in a few years, we might have models that are able to learn from smaller amounts of data. So it might just be, if you wish, some kind of a performance limitation, or it might be something principled. And I'm not going to answer this today, but rather, in addition to this factor, I would like to draw your attention to two additional factors. So two areas in which, at least seemingly, models and human infants learn language differently, and or two issues or two questions that are rarely discussed with respect to large language models. And so that are present in human language learning. And so one of the first issues is that babies are exposed to speech, right? So they get a physical signal that is continuous, concrete, has all its physical properties or characteristics. And so what I'm going to say, I'm going to talk about spoken language because that's just what I work on. But with relevant modifications, what I say should also apply to sign language and other modalities in which language can be expressed. So they get a physical signal for the most part. For hearing infants, at least, it's the speech signal that sort of you see caricatured here. And what infants develop on the basis of that is some kind of a mental representation, knowledge that is different in nature, right? So it is mental, symbolic, or abstract. To what extent, of course, is heatedly debated. What exactly it looks like is also heatedly debated. So, just plug in any of your favorite linguistic theories here. I'm not committed to anything in particular, but at the outcome of the language learning process, children and adults who they become later have some kind of mental, at least to some extent symbolic, at least to some extent abstract and discrete representation of language. So there is a mismatch in nature between the input and what children learn. And of course, once you look at production, on top of that, there is yet another level. So production, of course, is a sequence of motor commands or motor control. So yet another level of representation. So in natural language acquisition, there are multiple levels of quite different nature that come together as infants learn language. So this is one thing that potentially models for the time being lack, right? So of course, there are promising initiatives and work going in this direction, but for now, at least the well-known models and the most performant models learn from written text. And of course, written text is simplified with respect to spoken language in that it's already chunked, it's already symbolic in the sense that letters represent the abstract categories of phonemes, et cetera, et cetera. So it's facilitated in a number of ways, but not just simply easier, but it's of the same nature, of the same type as the final outcome or output, which is not true for humans. So that's one thing that I would like to talk about today, whether it is relevant that humans, when they learn language, learn from an input that is of a different type, of a different nature than what they learn and what they produce. So this is one of the things. The other question or the other issue is this same input, whatever its characteristics are, does not produce the same outcome at every time point in life. So early in life, this input gives rise to what we could call native linguistic knowledge or native linguistic competence. Much later in life, nobody exactly knows where, of course, the cutoff is, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about that. But say if you start learning a language at age 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, etc., you will gain some knowledge, but it's not going to be native-like. So the exact same input will give different outcomes or different results or different knowledge at different time points in life. And again, this is something that's not often discussed in terms of models, whether there are what we often call critical periods or sensitive periods, at least in human development. So time points in sort of during the training of a model that somehow are more important, more significant, or have a greater impact than others. And if that is the case, when and why this is so. So essentially what I would like to sort of call your attention to, and mostly I'm going to talk about babies. So I have less to say about how this is in models. This is much more of a sort of a presentation where I would like to call your attention to these issues or topics. I don't have answers, but I think actually these are important and relevant questions to ask. And so what I'm going to do is to illustrate how these processes unfold in human infants, so that if we are interested in the extent to which models can actually parallel this kind of development, then these are places we want to look at. So most importantly, development is dynamic. And so in a certain sense, we want to compare human development or certain aspects of human development, language acquisition, to models as they are being trained, not just the outcome, not just what they ultimately learn or they are ultimately able to do or not able to do, but also how this knowledge is built up. And so there are two particular dynamic processes that I mentioned already. The fact that the input is auditory. And so that's not just that it's a different modality than writing, but that there is first a mismatch between what is being heard, what is being learned, and then what is being produced. And also whether our auditory system is actually shaped through human evolution in a way that language actually needed to have certain characteristics because it emerged in a mammal, in a primate, that already had some specific auditory abilities, biases, perceptual capabilities. So this is going to be a crucial issue. And the second one is these auditory abilities, biases, etc., actually change during development. So as I said, the same input might not always give the same outcome as a function of age. And so this is what I will term critical periods. I will not go into the debates about whether it's critical, sensitive, etc. I'm going to, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably. Okay, so let's start out with language experience. And so one important point that I would like to make is that experience itself changes qualitatively during human development, and this might actually be crucial. So again, whether this is the case for models, I think is not very well known and maybe not even very much researched. And so this is sort of an encouragement to look at that. And so I'm going to make the claim that there is a specific chronology of our language experience, which starts actually prenatally, such that we first receive a simpler input prenatally, and then only the full speech signal postnatally. And that this sequence, this chronology, plays a role in how we develop language. And so I don't know whether there are parallels in models, whether it is the case that there is some sort of an initial bootstrap, some kind of simpler input, which then becomes more complex, and that helps training. So I think this is an important parallel, because as we will see, it is the case that in humans, this simpler initial bootstrap, this simpler prenatal signal, actually plays a considerable role, and infants who miss that or lose that actually have worse, not better, linguistic outcomes. So let's look at this in detail. So some of you might know that fetus is actually here already in the last couple of weeks, couple of months of gestation. So the auditory system, hearing, is operational from around 20, 22, 24 weeks of gestation, depending on what you measure and how you measure it. Of course, it's hard to measure fetal responses, but it's not impossible. So we know that fetuses can hear, but we also know that speech is not transmitted to the fetal ear as I speak now, right? It is not broadcast in open air, but rather the fetus is in a liquid and surrounded by the intrauterine environment, so maternal tissues. So this environment acts as a low-pass filter, mostly, and so this is what's illustrated here, mostly filtering out frequencies above 4, 6, or maybe 100 hertz, or maybe 1000 hertz. So essentially, the low frequencies are preserved, the higher frequencies are gone. And so, of course, you can see here the spectrogram and the waveform. And so this is normal postnatal speech as we know it. This is the prenatal signal. So you can see that the lower frequencies are preserved, but energy in the higher frequencies are suppressed. And so this means that actually the fundamental frequency of the speaker and the modulations of that fundamental frequency are what arrive to the fetus. And so essentially this means that prosody and modulations of prosody are preserved. And so by prosody, I mean the rhythm and the melody. So intonation, rhythm of speech. But the fine details, so individual consonants and vowels, maybe some vowels, since they carry a lot of energy and have formants in the lower frequency ranges, potentially some vowels are preserved. Certainly not all of them, and definitely consonants are quite strongly suppressed. So individual phonemes, and thus individual words, are not accessible to the fetus. So it's mostly some kind of a prosodic pattern. And so this is an illustration, of course, just a simulation of what this might sound like to the fetus. So if you heard this as being faint and distant, that's quite right. You could clearly hear it was a female voice. You got some sort of idea of its rhythm, its melody, but of course you couldn't make out the words. It's actually a sentence in Spanish. And so this is what fetuses get. It's an impoverished signal in a certain sense. So it's just prosody, not phonemes. But my strong claim is going to be that this is exactly what they need. This originally impoverished signal helps to set up or bootstrap certain things, which will then be the scaffolding for postnatal language development. So essentially, what happens is that these low frequencies, so the prosody, these low frequency signals, actually already fine-tuned to the rhythm and melody, in particular the rhythm of the native language, neural oscillations in the brain, delta and theta, which are slow. So which are exactly at these frequencies. And these are responsible for prosody exactly. So delta is the oscillation that is believed to sort of process or participate in the processing of larger prosodic units, utterances, phrases, and theta corresponds to syllabic rhythm. And so we know that syllable rate is crucial for speech understanding. So these two frequencies, as a result of this prenatal experience, might already be fine-tuned to the rhythm of the prenatally experienced language. After birth, when all the frequencies, including the higher frequencies, become available, then the fast oscillation gamma that is responsible for phonemes, phonemic processing, also becomes fine-tuned to the phonology of the native language. But crucially, since it's chronologically later, it arrives chronologically later, it gets embedded into this existing hierarchy of slower oscillations. And it's this kind of chronology that takes care of the fact that these oscillations don't just run independently, but rather they're aligned. So this is what allows us to process a phoneme as a phoneme, but at the same time as part of a syllable, which is part of a word, which is part of a phrase, which is part of a sentence, right? So this hierarchy of the oscillations is what allows us to actually process linguistic units in a hierarchical fashion, as they actually are in language, right? And so the further claim that I will make is not only that this sequence or this chronology is necessary, but also that later these rhythms actually, because they are aligned with important prosodic units, so phonemes, syllables, phonological phrases, actually act as bootstraps or a scaffolding for acquiring syntax or the basis of grammar, because they chunk the input into units that will be relevant for syntax and semantics potentially. So they will help bootstrap some kind of basic phrase structure. And so the strong claim, and there is, I'm not going to talk about that today, but there is evidence to suggest that indeed infants who are born prematurely, so they miss out on this early experience, or who are born deaf, born full term, but deaf, and so again, they miss out on this early experience, actually don't have better language outcomes, rather they have worse language outcomes. So you could argue, well, if input, just large quantities of input is always better, then actually preterm infants would benefit because they get the full speech signal earlier. So they should be better off, but that's exactly the opposite of what really happens. So the strong claim here is that the nature of the input matters. Starting small is important, and the timing is important. And again, the relevant question is whether something similar could be found in when we train models. So just briefly to give you some evidence about all of this. This is a study, a series of studies actually that we've been conducting. We tested newborn infants at birth, so really 1, 2, 3 days at the hospital when they are born. We followed them up at 6 months. So it's actually the same participant in the study at birth and at 6 months. And now we are collecting data at 24 months. That's not ready yet, so I'm not going to show much data from these older children at this point. Essentially, we are looking at their neural oscillations using very standard auditory locations or electrode sites. And so what they hear is essentially very simply speech in English, French, and Spanish. French is their native language, so these are babies born in Paris to mothers who only spoke French during pregnancy. And the stimuli are very simple infant-directed sentences from Goldilocks and the sort of translation equivalents of Goldilocks and the Three Bears in all of these languages. So the infants listen to 100 repetitions of the same sentence in French, which is the language they heard prenatally. They also listen to a translation equivalent in Spanish, which is a language that they did not hear prenatally, but which is rhythmically similar to French. And behavioral studies suggest that at birth, infants recognize the rhythm of the native language, but can't discriminate rhythmically similar languages. So we don't expect newborns, at least behaviorally, to discriminate between French and Spanish. Now we also have English, which is again unfamiliar, but rhythmically quite different. So here we do expect behaviorally already, and this has been shown, we expect discrimination. So let me just show you the English sentence as an example. You will hear it's nice infant-directed speech.
The bears lived all together in a beautiful house.
Right. So what we did was to look at their neural oscillations in native, so prenatal language, an unfamiliar but rhythmically similar, an unfamiliar rhythmically different language. We also measured activation during rest. I'm not going to talk about that now. So essentially what we get is good looking time frequency responses. So if you're familiar with EEG, then this is just what you expect. Crucially, of course, what we are interested in is, given our predictions, is whether the slow neural oscillations, delta and theta, so between 1 and 3 and 4 and 8 hertz, are already somehow different for French and maybe Spanish than for English. And this is exactly what we find. So first I'm showing you the delta band in the frontal locations that are indicated here. You see that there is increased responses to French and Spanish as compared to English. This is also true for theta, the theta band, so the syllabic rhythm, again, increased responses to French and Spanish as compared to English. But importantly, there are no differences in gamma. So at birth, the slower oscillations, theta and delta, corresponding to the prenatal experience, are fine-tuned, and they distinguish between the rhythm of the native or prenatally heard language and a rhythmically different language. But this is not true for the fast oscillations. It's important because phonemes are there in the stimuli. So these are normal sentences that you can hear. So the acoustic information is there in the stimuli. If newborns were somehow responding to the phonemes specifically, or would somehow be boosted for French phonemes already, then they have that in the input. They could show increased gamma for French, let's say, as opposed to English, but they don't. Now something different happens at 6 months. So indeed, along the lines of what I presented, prenatal experience seems to be fine-tuning the slower oscillations, not the faster ones. And the prediction of the hypothesis is that these faster oscillations, so gamma comes online, becomes fine-tuned to the native language only later. And indeed, in 6-month-olds, what we find is statistically stronger gamma to French than to the other 2 languages. So it indeed seems to be the case that the sequence of first low-pass filtered and then full band signal somehow prepares the auditory system for the type of neural architecture that we know is responsible for speech processing, even in adults. Now, as I said, prenatal experience mostly consists of prosody, and we've seen the sort of the impact of rhythm on the neural architecture. But prosody is more than just rhythm. And so we were interested in actually establishing whether they learn specific prosodic patterns, whether newborns know or show evidence of having learned specific prosodic patterns from this prenatal signal. And I will tell you why that becomes relevant. Indeed, the claim will be, as I showed initially, is that the claim will be that these prenatally learned rhythms bootstrap or scaffold language acquisition, not just learning about the prosody, but also about word order. So like most sounds, prosody is carried by 3 acoustic dimensions. So pitch, or the height or the frequency of a sound, intensity, loudness, and duration, length. And importantly, differences in pitch, intensity, and duration carry prosodic prominence. And it's been known for almost 120 years now that these acoustic dimensions, not in the language domain, but originally just in the simple auditory domain or in music, so just even playing pure tones or simple auditory stimuli, create perceptual groupings or perceptual illusions in a certain sense that are biases. So this sounds complicated, but what this really means is quite simple. If you have a sequence of sounds that contrast in duration, so long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, then even if the gaps between them, the space between them is isochronous, so there is no grouping, they really come at equal distances, then your auditory system anyway perceives them as being grouped, and the grouping is short-long. So the prominent element is at the end. It's iambic, as linguists would call it. So essentially prominence final, short-long. If the contrast is durational. If the contrast is a pitch contrast or an intensity contrast, then again, even though there is no grouping, we can't help but hear it as being grouped. But this time for pitch and intensity, the grouping is prominence initial or trochaic, so high or strong sound first. And so the best illustration of this, or the most well-known illustration of this, is the ambulance siren, which sounds like this, at least in some countries. And so even if there is no grouping, many people report hearing high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low, with high, low being one unit and high, the prominent element being initial. So here we have this auditory bias. It's independent of language. It was well established, again, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, or even the end of the 19th century, for basic auditory processing. We have this bias, this perceptual bias. And importantly, it's as if evolutionarily languages emerged to make use of this, to leverage this bias in a certain sense. So some languages use different auditory dimensions. Some languages use duration, others speech or intensity to indicate prosodic prominence. So French and Italian, for example, use final lengthening. The prominent element is final, and it's lengthened in duration. Japanese and Hindi, Farsi, Korean, I could cite a few other examples, tend to use pitch or intensity, which gives rise to prominence initial trochaic grouping. So even if there is no actual grouping, by using one cue rather than another, your auditory system will impose grouping. And so you get essentially chunks, prosodic chunks, that will correspond to syntactic chunks for free, right? So the important thing about these biases are they're there independent of language, and then they can be leveraged or recruited potentially evolutionarily, or who knows how, such that they guide our perception towards a structure, an organization, prominence final, prominence initial, that actually will correspond to linguistic units. But so essentially, it's very important that this is there in the prenatal experience. Remember, prosody and the type of cues that infants get are there in prenatal experience. So in one near-infrared spectroscopy study, now we were interested in establishing whether newborns also show this iambic trochaic grouping bias, the rhythmic grouping bias. So in adults, this is done in a very simple way. You can give adults these isochronous streams, like the ambulance that you heard, where the spacing of the sounds is equivalent, is the same. There's no grouping. It's just the contrast that you manipulate. So whether it's a pitch, an intensity, or a durational contrast, and you can ask adults what they heard, whether they heard high, low, long, short, short, long, etc., etc. But of course, we can't ask newborns. So what we did, instead of giving them an ambiguous stream and asking how they perceived it, rather we gave them all possible options. So for a durational contrast, we gave them the iambic grouping, which is consistent with the adult bias. So short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long seems like a natural grouping, consistent with the adult grouping. The trochaic one, long, short, long, short. So something like ta, 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 doesn't seem that natural. These were pure tones, so nothing linguistic. These are just beeps. We also had a no contrast condition, so equal durations. Same logic for all the other cues. So these are separate groups of infants. One group of infants was tested on a durational contrast, another group of infants on a pitch contrast. So either low-high, which goes against the adult bias, or high-low, which goes along with so it's consistent with the adult bias. Again, for intensity, the same logic. And essentially, we simply tested whether newborn infants' responses to the consistent or inconsistent groupings somehow discriminate them, whether they respond differently. So simply whether somehow the fact that one grouping is consistent would help processing. And so we expected or predicted a greater response, some kind of a surprise or error response to the inconsistent grouping. And so importantly, we could not manipulate prenatal experience, but we took advantage of the fact that in Paris, you can find infants prenatally exposed to lots of languages. So in one group, we tested French monolinguals. And if you remember, French uses a durational contrast. So these are infants who had prenatal experience with this contrast. We tested another group of French monolinguals with an intensity contrast. So remember, this is not a cue that French prosody uses to express prominence. So here, these infants had no prenatal experience. And for pitch, we were lucky enough to be able to recruit both a French monolingual, but also a French other language bilingual group, such that the other language actually heavily relied on pitch for its prosody. So for this one condition, we could compare a group of infants who had no prenatal experience with a given cue and another group who had prenatal experience. And here's what we found. So what you see in red are the channels and the brain areas that respond more to the inconsistent grouping, the grouping that is not adult-like. And what we find is that the duration condition, so monolingual French infants in the duration condition and bilingual infants in the pitch condition responded more, as we predicted, to the inconsistent grouping. They found it more difficult. They didn't like the inconsistent grouping. At the same time, particularly this comparison is very telling, for this exact same stimuli, the monolingual French infants who had no prenatal experience with the cue showed no distinction. Okay, so essentially what you can derive from this is that having prenatal experience with a specific type of prosodic patterns allows infants to show the grouping that is typical of their native language. So indeed, they learn the type of grouping they hear prenatally. So that's very nice in itself. That's interesting. They already learn about the prosody of their native language. But what I'm trying to argue here is that this prenatal experience will be crucial not only to learn about prosody itself, but also to learn about one specific aspect of grammar, word order. So we take now a step back from prosody, and we will get back to it in a second. And then I will tell you why I think the whole thing is particularly relevant for models. So in a very simplified way, we can typologically distinguish between functor final or object-verb languages and functor initial or verb-object languages. So languages like Japanese or Turkish have an order whereby the verb follows the object, right? So apple, eat, rather than eat an apple, which would be the order in Italian, English, or French. Together with this, they have, so Japanese-like languages, OV, functor final languages have postpositions, whereas functor initial VO languages have prepositions. Now, this is a really basic distinction. So it's a general typological distinction. And so if you're going to learn your native language, the moment you have two words, you somehow have to decide what their order or relationship is. And so we hypothesized that, and this is a discussion that sort of goes back to the previous talk, we hypothesized that some functors, like pre or postpositions, are so common, they're so frequent, that infants may be able to track their relative position, even just from a few utterances. So we know that even very young infants are sensitive to the beginnings and ends of utterances. And so if they link these perceptual cues, so beginning of utterance or end of utterance, to just word frequency, where do I find the most frequent words? In Japanese, it's going to be at the end of utterances. In Italian or English or French, it's going to be at the beginning of utterances. So if they can track just the 10, 20, 30 most frequent words and identify their location, then they will be arriving at important correlates of the native, the word order of their native language. And so we actually tested whether, in this sense, young infants, so these are 7, 8 month olds, rely on word frequency to establish word order. So we assume that by this age, 7, 8 months, they have some basic idea of the word order of their native language. So the task doesn't teach them this, but rather measures whether they bring this knowledge to the task. So we created an artificial grammar that is ambiguous in terms of its order. We have categories A and B that are always systematically mapped onto the same syllable. A is always ge, B is always fi. Whereas categories X and Y are mapped onto one of 9 different syllables. So individual tokens of X and Y, so say the syllable fo, is 9 times less frequent in the stream than the syllable ge, right? So we have a strict alternation between frequent, infrequent, frequent, infrequent, frequent, infrequent, okay? And so there is this artificial grammar that consists of this strict alternation. And we rammed the beginning and the end of the stream such that there's no phase information. You can't hear what the first syllable was. You can't hear what the last syllable is. So the structure is completely ambiguous between a frequent initial and a frequent final parts. So if you're like Italian or English or French, you would think, well, okay, my language is such that it starts with a frequent item and it goes, so the basic unit goes until I see the exact same item again, right? So it's AXBY, 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 or frequent, infrequent, frequent, infrequent, etc. If your knowledge or your representation of the word order of your native language is Japanese-like, then you will say, no, I will start with an infrequent word and finish on a frequent word. Start again with an infrequent word and finish on a frequent one, right? So essentially this stream is ambiguous between these 2 parses. And essentially what we did in the test very simply was to present items that were both in the stream. So all the items we present are familiar. They were always included in the familiarization stream. Half of them were frequent initial, the other half frequent final. So I'll make you listen to the stream and to the test items. Kind of boring. Kids had to listen to this for 4 minutes, but kind of they managed. And so now our question was, do you think this, I mean, really, we didn't ask them, obviously. It was a looking time measure, and I'll show you. But the question is, does this sound familiar to them, or does this sound familiar to them? Really, technically, they were both familiar. They were all taken from the stream.
Fifogebi, fifogebi, fifogebi. Bagebofi, bagebofi, bagebofi.
And so indeed, this was a head turn preference study. So we measured infants' looking time. And the crucial manipulation is we tested Japanese and Italian infants. The study was exactly the same. The stimuli were exactly the same. There was nothing in the study that would bias the child one way or the other way. Yet, if Japanese and Italian infants show different preferences, so say Italian infants a frequent initial preference and Japanese infants a frequent final preference, then that can only be because they already have a representation of their native word order. And this is what we found. So here you can see the looking times of the Japanese infants. They have a preference for longer looking times to the frequent final items. So remember, postpositions like in Japanese. And the Italian kids have the opposite, a preference for the frequent initial items. Again, prepositions like in Italian. So at 7, 8 months, they already have a representation, and they use frequency to sort of anchor somehow word order around these frequent words, which are like functors. Now here comes prosody. Because of course, you may be a Japanese-Italian bilingual. So what do you do then, right? If in your input you have both frequent initial and frequent final structures, then you need something to disambiguate. And so remember, prosody. We said that if you hear a contrast in pitch or intensity, then you will automatically group it as prominence initial. If you hear a contrast that that is based on duration, you will automatically group it as prominence final. And so essentially the prominence, the position of the prominence is given to you by your auditory system. And remember, this grouping is something you've learned already prenatally. So at age 7, 8 months, you know which way your language is grouped. But importantly, this of course corresponds then to syntax, in that the prominence falls on content words and the non-prominent element is a functor. And so this gives you word order, right? So essentially, if you hear a contrast that is pitch or intensity based, you will be in a Japanese-like functor final language. If you hear a contrast that is duration based, you will be in an Italian-like language. And we actually measure this. So we have a corpus of different languages in which we measured prosodic prominence, and indeed functor final languages use pitch or intensity to indicate prosodic prominence, whereas functor initial languages use duration. So this is based on actual measurements. And so now what we did was we used the same artificial grammar, but instead of leaving it ambiguous, we now added prosody. So one group of infants heard pitch-based prosody, like in Japanese. Another group of infants heard a duration-based prosody, like it would be the case in Italian. So let me listen.
So you
can hear the modulation. Yeah, this is a bit more subtle, but still you can hear the modulation. So essentially now, instead of leaving the structure ambiguous, we give infants a cue. Go Japanese or go Italian, right? Go OV, go VO. And so essentially, if they rely on prosody to bootstrap word order, then in this case, they should show a Japanese-like preference. In that case, they should show an Italian-like preference. The test items are the same as before, and they have no prosody. They're completely flat. And here the important point is that we also tested a group of monolinguals, but what we should focus on are the OVVO bilinguals. So these are infants who are bilingual between a functor initial and a functor final language. The functor initial language is English, because this was run in Janet Worker's lab in Vancouver. So English is the functor initial language, and the functor final language can be any of a large number of OV languages tested in the greater Vancouver area. So Japanese, Korean, Farsi, Hindi, etc., etc. Crucially, these infants are familiar with both word orders. The question is whether they use prosody to select one or the other. And this is exactly what we found. So let's focus on this part. Essentially, you can see these are the bilingual infants, and giving them OV prosody makes them look longer at the frequent final structures, like in Japanese. Giving them VO prosody makes them look longer at the functor initial structures, like in Italian or English. So essentially, prosody, which is already part of prenatal experience, bootstraps basic word order and the functor content word distinction. So important notions for grammar, but it derives from an extremely early prenatal experience. So again, this chronology of simple first, then complex is something that is crucial and goes along the way and accompanies children in learning not just about prosody itself, but grammar. So it scaffolds language acquisition. And so the question is whether any kind of change in the nature of the input would be relevant for, helpful to, or the opposite, may be detrimental to training models. So, and that's because, and here is this issue that I was mentioning at the beginning. Here, notice that there's a correlation between something in the physical signal and something in the underlying structure, right? So we are, infants are relying on an auditory bias to derive something that is grammatical. So in this sense, it looks like when humans learn language, the fact that there are two levels is not a hindrance, but rather there are mechanisms that efficiently help children map one onto the other, or biases that constrain them to do it right. Okay? So that's important. And so they need perceptual sensitivities to pick up on the relevant features of the physical signal. But, and this is the second part of what I would like to talk about today. Maybe István, can I ask you, how am I doing for time? I don't, I forgot to look at
You're fine, you're fine.
Done?
No, you're, just a second, I have to get closer.
I'll take another 5 minutes.
You're fine, don't worry.
Okay, good, thank you. So, so essentially, as I said, there is an important issue about having perceptual biases and sensitivities. But indeed, we know that these, so the input changes across development, but the sensitivities themselves also change. So this is the other dynamic process. And so having the same input at different time points in life actually gives you different results. And again, this is something that would be or should be looked at when understanding to what extent models learn similarly to humans. Is it the case that input at any moment in the training will result in better or worse learning as a function of where you are in the trajectory? So, of course, this is taken from biology. This is known as, these effects are known as critical periods. So essentially time points or windows of opportunity in the lifespan of an individual when experience plays a larger role or models or shapes the system more than at other time points. And so this is not my own work, but I guess this is quite well known. I still think it's very important to remember. So classic work by Janet Worker and then lots of other people since then. We know that this, for example, underlies foreign or second language accents. This phenomenon in particular in learning the phonology of a language is known as perceptual narrowing. So there is a Hindi contrast. So in Hindi, there are several consonants, let's say D for the sake of the example, have two versions, a dental one where the tongue is close to the teeth. This is similar to the English D, but Hindi also has a retroflex D where the tongue is curled up or rolled up, da, something like that. And these are two different phonemes. This is a contrastive difference in Hindi and English. Of course, Hindi say the two D sounds easily, whereas English adults cannot. Now, the question, of course, is what happens during development? And again, as probably this is very well known, actually, it is the case. It's not the case that Hindi infants learn this. Rather, they maintain an ability that initially even English-exposed infants have, and then they lose as a function of experience, or rather lack of experience. So perceptual narrowing is the phenomenon whereby from the general, very broad-based, almost universal perceptual abilities we have at birth, those that are necessary for our native language are maintained through experience. Those that are not used in our native language or the language environment we are exposed to are lost or seriously diminished or reduced. So as you can see, English-exposed infants at 6 to 8 months and 8 to 10 months are still able to make the Hindi dental retroflex distinction, but by 10 months, the ability disappears. And so this was it is a very well-known effect. There's quite a lot of discussion, especially nowadays. There's 30, 40 years of research now on this. And so this is a recent meta-analysis with all dots being different studies with different kinds of contrasts. There are findings going in different directions, but the most robust finding, even after 40 years of research, is that native contrasts, so this is the blue line here, the blue dots, native contrasts are preserved or they improve. So this is age in month, and this is the effect size of discrimination. Native contrasts are preserved, non-native contrasts are lost to some extent, sometimes completely, sometimes just harder, but there is a well-established perceptual narrowing effect. Now, this perceptual narrowing, or at least the beginning of how experience shapes our perceptual system, seems to be extremely early. This is work, one of several papers from the late Ann Cutler's group, where they compared two groups on how they can learn a Korean contrast. So Korean has a three-way consonantal contrast, and they tested two groups of participants: monolingual Dutch people born in the Netherlands who have always spoken Dutch their whole lives and had no experience with Korean. That was the control group. The experimental group, so the interesting group, are adoptees. So these are Korean adoptees into the Netherlands. So they are people who were born in Korea and early in life, during the first couple of years, were adopted into Dutch-speaking families in the Netherlands. They stopped having any input in Korean. At the time of testing, they were adults. They had no knowledge of Korean whatsoever. Many of them don't even remember anything. Some of them were very young infants when they were adopted. So they are perfect Dutch native speakers, like the other group, except for this very early first exposure to Korean for the first few months or first few years of life. What and Cutler group did was to train them on a Korean contrast. So for Dutch controls, this is completely novel. For the adoptees, on the surface, so before the training, they don't do any better than the Dutch controls. They seem not to have any advantage in perceiving this contrast. But once you give them training, they actually seem to learn the contrast faster and achieve a better performance. The Dutch speakers also improve a little bit, but they fall behind the Korean adoptees. Importantly, they separated the Korean adoptee group into two groups. Half of the adoptees were adopted very, very early, so before 5 months. So before perceptual narrowing really made them lose the ability to discriminate non-native contrasts. So this is a time where we think perception is still quite broadly based and universal. And yet, if you compare them, so this line here is the same as this one. If you compare them to the Dutch control group, they improve quite a bit more, right? So even those who were not adopted late, they were not yet speakers of Korean. So in the group, there were also participants who were adopted at age, say, 2 years. So they spoke Korean, they had some knowledge of Korean. So there you wouldn't be surprised that they can relearn it. But these participants were adopted extremely early. They barely had a little bit, just a few months of experience with Korean, yet they show the same advantage. So essentially, this early perceptual experience seems to be shaping the perceptual system in some lasting way. And so you could say, well, okay, but that's just speech. What does that have to do? So hopefully I try to convince you that the fact that we are using a modality for learning language, like spoken language, has or potentially has a role in how we learn. But well, okay, models don't use speech. But actually another recent study using online testing, sort of a gamified testing protocol, testing 500,000 participants, so a really huge number of participants, also found sensitive or critical periods for vocabulary and grammar. So this was an online test, and so it wasn't auditory, it was answering questions, multiple choice questions, so it was all written material. And what you can see is that this is age at which participants started learning English. So it was about learning or knowing English grammar. And the accuracy, so you see the age at which exposure to English began, and here you see accuracy, simply. So red are the monolingual native English speakers. Of course, they are at ceiling by definition. And what you can see is color-coded here are different groups as a function of when they started learning English. Those who started before age 9 actually achieve native-like or very close to native-like competence in English. Those who started late don't. And this is true whether you're an immersion learner or a non-immersion learner. So it seems like this is the result of some kind of sophisticated modeling on the basis of the data. Essentially, it looks like there is a critical period. It's much longer than what we usually think. So it's somewhere around 16, 17, 18 years of age. The ability to learn the grammar and the vocabulary of a new language seems to drop. So there is a longer than expected, but still finite window of opportunity for learning non-perceptual, or at least not obviously perceptual aspects like grammar and vocabulary. Which of course leads to the hypothesis that there potentially may be different critical periods for language, maybe with cascading effects. And so this is to say the timing of input matters. And again, if we are interested in how models or whether models learn similarly to human infants, this would need to be taken into account. So I would like to leave you with just these 4 questions. So no answers, but rather questions here. On the basis of what we see in infants, it looks like timing and sequentiality matters. So there are critical periods when a given amount of or a given nature of experience will make a different impact than later, which seems to be, at least on the face of it, different from the type of cumulative learning that models show. So it's not the case that the more you hear, the better you get, because the same 10 or 20 years of exposure or experience early in life or late in life will not have the same effect. And actually, you would think older learners would be better, but this is not the case. And indeed, there is quite ample evidence for sensitive or critical periods. And I would also like to make the argument that the fact that we are learning from a physical input like speech or sign language that has certain properties, and those are perceived by our perceptual systems in some predefined ways, will actually contribute to learning and might have played a role evolutionarily in shaping language. And so forming language in ways that are compatible with our perceptual biases. And again, we would like to know whether this is the case or anything similar is the case for large language models. So thank you very much for your attention.
Bravo. Judith, I have to tell, je vais parler français maintenant. Si vous voulez poser des questions à Judith en français, soyez à l'aise. Elle est quadrilingue. Vous pouvez poser des questions en hongrois et en italien si vous voulez. Est-ce qu'il y en a davantage de langues, Judith?
Espagnol. Je pourrais faire espagnol.
Aussi.
Mais bon.
Okay. So actually, Alessandro Lenci, who will now be giving the discussion, could if he slips on anything in English, he can switch to Italian because he's next door.
Yeah, I know that Judith speaks Italian, so we already met exactly for the problems of language model and how to train language model with children data. So thanks a lot, Judith, for the great talk. So I would like to start with an observation. So we learned a lot about the poverty of the stimulus argument. Actually, I think you make a point about the richness of the stimulus, in the sense that it's of course quantitatively poorer, in the sense that, but is also physically richer. absolutely richer than the one that are used by language models that are typically just trained on text, so on transcribed text. You know? So it seems that what you showed is exactly that the speech signal is richer with respect to the possibility of determining groupings. So it already, while you don't have any information about the groupings from text, because you are just a sequence of characters and words, but you don't have any real physical clue about how to group them. The dimension of pitch, intensity, and duration, so gives idea of way to group them, right? So it means that this is a clue about that allow you to bootstrap the grouping that is important for hierarchical structure and so on. So one question that I have is the following. So, okay, you are working on speech signals, and so you show that perception of prenatal speech already gives information about that guide the children towards the correct groupings or the groups that it's consistent with language, right? So I was wondering whether, because there are other signals than the child receives after birth that also are rich, for instance, perception, visual perception, and so on, that allow again for groupings in this way, right? So to bootstrap hierarchical structure. So I guess the point is the fact that the environment is probably much richer in order to guide us, in order to build the scaffolding of hierarchical structure that then is used in order to learn a grammar. So I was wondering whether exactly this role of perception of speech perception is according for you even more prominent than other type of perceptual signals than the child receives after birth, like perception, visual perception and other, and so on. And that was my first question. And the second question is the following. You, of course, you haven't worked on deaf children, but what is your idea about the acquisition of grammar by those children that lack this type of, let's say, initial scaffolding in that sense? So that was my...
Okay, thank you very much. So these are, of course, questions I thought a lot about, and they're definitely very interesting. So if I may start with where you started. So it wasn't the question, but kind of the framework of the poverty of stimulus versus the richness of the signal. So I think these things go hand in hand, right? So we can learn a language, or languages could have evolved to be the way they are. That is not the structure is not encoded explicitly, precisely because the signal at the perceptual level is rich. So I think these things go together, and I really strongly think, and there is growing evidence about how some of the basic properties of language exploit properties of the mammalian auditory system, or the biomechanics of how we can move our mouth, etc., etc. Without being reductionist. So of course, language is not just this, but this is, I think, part of it. And the two go hand in hand. So that's kind of important. Now, visual cues completely. So actually, we did do a very similar study to the prosody study where we had, remember, so what I presented was just giving prosody as cues to word order. But prosody is accompanied, for example, by facial or hand gestures. And so we also tested infants. We just didn't have the possibility, so it was only adults. In this artificial grammar, where we don't provide auditory prosodic cues, but there's an avatar who will nod at places of prosodic prominence. And no, actually, we did have an infant study too. It just wasn't that strong. But at least by 5 months, adults, of course, and also 5-month-olds do start to pick up on this. So I would think that this is just like sign language, right? So this is not related to the auditory modality as the only one channel. It is related to anything that we can biologically produce. So sign language doesn't, of course, doesn't have pitch as a height, but it has the velocity of movement. And so there is work by Marina Nespor and collaborators showing how these same parameters correspond to something else in sign language or in gestures. So I think this applies to, I don't know what all the cues are, but I think certainly it's a logical possibility. And there is some empirical evidence that we are sensitive to a lot of cues in other modalities. So of course, the talking face is the most prominent one and one that a child receives immediately, right? So I would think that as much as the physical world is there, for a very young infant, before they can locomote, it really is mostly social cues that they get rather than physical cues, and that comes later. So yes, I completely agree with you, and I think there is some evidence, at least from our work, that very simple eyebrow movements, head nods are visual cues accompanying prosody that infants can pick up on. Now, second question, deaf infants. So we actually are working with deaf infants precisely, and premature infants. The work is not done, completed, but both our results and other people's results, work by Thierry Nazi, other people with premature infants, suggest that they, of course, prematurity is it's difficult because it causes lots of things, right? So it's a risk factor for many things, but they lack, so rather, their language development is most delayed with respect to prosody. So this is the thing that they lack, right? So premature infants start to hear phonemes at birth like full-term infants. And so it seems that they're not missing out on that, right? They are premature, but otherwise they're not missing out on that experience. What they're missing out on is prenatal experience. And the same for deaf infants. And so it looks like, and this is what makes me say that the chronology might be really crucial for scaffolding or laying the foundations for language, that indeed what is problematic in these infants are the large things, prosody, rhythm, etc. And so in that sense, again, I think thinking about the models, I would be really curious to know if you could train a model with different types of input. So, take ChatGPT and now train it on impoverished texts in the beginning. Would that help or hinder, right? So you can imagine sort of analogous experiments, or train it on, I don't know, just books for children. So grammar is simpler, vocabulary is smaller. Would those learn faster, right? So obviously large language models by their very nature are large and they need a lot of data. But one relevant question is, maybe we could get around this data-hungry nature by giving some kind of optimized input, the right type of input. So these are kind of the questions that arise in this regard.
Yeah. Well, actually, it seems that, there is this BabyLM initiative, right, of training small language models with more, let's say, ecological input and so on. Well, it seems that in a way, still, for instance, different approaches to curriculum learning, so exactly exposing the models to increasingly complex, structurally more complex data. People expected that this might improve the models, and it's actually, that's not apparently that's not what has occurred. Okay, so I think that's an important question really to study what is the effect of because exactly my intuition is that providing the model the right type of input might speed up their ability to find some structure. Now I have Stephen just time for another question.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. See.
Okay, thank you. So you show that you talk about chunking, right? So prosody helps chunking the signal. On the other hand, one could say, okay, but grammar and syntax is not only chunking, right? It's hierarchical grouping in this way. This means the ability of, let's say, building recursive structures, so to say.
Right.
Okay. Do you think that prosody, or do you have evidence that prosody is also conducive to that? So not only word order, for instance, word order preference, but for instance, phrase boundaries or something like that?
Right. Okay, so this, of course, is the million-dollar question. Yeah. And I leave much of, I mean, the comfortable position to be able to say it's Virginia who is going to answer these difficult questions. So she will talk more about syntax. But my 2 cents on this is that just like prosody, if you look at the auditory signal, well, that's linear. But underlyingly, we perceive it as a hierarchy of units. And that's potentially related to, say, at the neural level, the hierarchy of oscillations. I would think it's something similar. So essentially, when you perceive prosody and prosodic boundaries, you have, given the neural architecture or whatever else, you know that these are sort of telescoped together, hierarchical things that are telescoped together. So whenever there's a prosodic boundary, you're potentially representing a prosodic boundary, but which coincides with a word boundary and a syllable boundary. And so just that kind of forces you to, you know, untelescope your linear thing. So language, of course, is linear. It's a single time series of sound, right? But I think given the neural architecture that's behind it, there is evidence to suggest that we unpack it hierarchically. So there is nice work in adults, and we are doing something similar in babies, but we don't yet have definitive results. But there's nice work from David Pöppel's lab, how he was looking at how brains of English and Chinese speaking participants respond to a kind of artificial grammar, which is simplified Chinese. So the question was, the signal is the same, but you either speak the language or you don't. What frequencies, what oscillations activate? And in the English speakers, it's only syllabic rhythm. So theta oscillations activate because they can perceive the syllables, but nothing more. In Chinese speakers, theta, delta, and all the other oscillations corresponding to the exact phrase structure of the sentences that activated. We are getting something similar with this OVVO, the frequent-infrequent paradigm I presented. We are getting something similar in 6-month-olds. So over time, as they listen to this stream, first we get theta in response to just the syllables. But as the structure emerges perceptually to them with the repetitions, actually we see the frequency of the larger units emerge in their brain responses. Of course, the brain is far away from something ideal syntactic, but you know, in infants, it's very hard to get. So it's already a big deal to get a reliable brain response. So I would say there is at least this kind of indirect evidence to say you perceive prosody as a composite of really different levels.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessandro.
Okay. Yes, we're ready for questions from the audience or from the wider audience. Go ahead. In fact, just come here, unless you want to. Yeah. Say your name. Oh. Okay. Yes.
I'm Sayara. I'm an undergrad in cognitive science, so I've been wondering, like if you train a model to behave kind of like how infants acquire language, wouldn't that model be significantly, like if it's specifically supposed to mirror how infants learn language versus it's specifically created to mirror how adults learn language, wouldn't the architecture be different? Because children, when they're very young, do not distinguish between different phones. The same as adults. Like adults, there is what language they are native to, that determines which phones have significance and which don't. Children don't have that. So wouldn't the architecture of the model differ?
Right. Okay. So this is a very exciting question. So the way I understand what you're asking is, would a large language model behave more like a native language acquiring young infant, or more like a second language learning adult in a certain sense, right? Of course, I don't know the answer, but I think that's a really good question to ask. And so essentially what you're suggesting is, well, if there is no critical period, so say large language models are such that the more you feed them input, the better they behave. Well, that's not like an infant in the sense that you need input at the right time. 10 years of input from 0 to 10 doesn't give you the same result as 10 years of input, or even 20 or 30 years of input from, say, 40 to 50 or to 60. And so maybe what the large language models look like is not like a human infant, but more like a human adult learning a second language. That can very well be. I think these are the kinds of questions that, by looking under the hood and understanding what the states of the model are at different points in training, well, you could empirically answer this question. So I think that's actually the right type of question to ask. I, of course, don't know the answer, but this is exactly what I think modeling work could be telling us. So definitely, great question.
Good. More questions? Meanwhile, I want to ask Judith a question. At what point, I mean, you said 10 years. I mean, how many of your languages came after that?
Oh, yeah. I only learned English younger than 10. Everything else I learned later.
All later. Okay. So so are you some sort of a mutant, or is this?
No. Just when you're a linguist, you know how to hide your defects, right? So I know what I don't know. Yeah.
Virginia, do you want to chime in on what you're planning to say that follows from this?
I did have a question for you based on Alessandro's question about the richness of the input. So the babies are imposing an order on that input that it does not actually have. So
it does, but it's not right. Okay, so I'll wait for you to finish your question.
Well, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Right. So that is
in your experiments, not in the actual.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Right. Exactly. So without prosody, the artificial grammar is like a Necker cube, right? You can see it one way or another. It's perfectly ambiguous between perceiving it as frequent word initial or frequent word final. Totally. There's no cue. Both are fine. Now, we tested Japanese infants and Italian infants. So they come with a so if at age 6, 7, 8 months, they already have some idea of the basic word order of Japanese and Italian, which is exactly the opposite, then they come to this task with different expectations. So they perceive the same thing, but one group imposes a functor final, the other group a functor initial parse on the exact same stimuli. Yes.
So from the point of view of the poverty of the stimulus, or not the poverty, the richness of the stimulus is rich in a particular way, in part because the baby is constructed so that it can extract that regularity.
Exactly. I fully agree. So essentially, what, translating it into linguistic terms, what the babies are doing, according to my idea, is that they're looking for the functors, right? The function words that actually Eva nicely introduced, those little grammatical words for those who are not linguists, that actually determine or indicate or signal grammatical structure. And so there are different cues, and work from my lab, but also from other people's lab, Rushen's work with Janet Worker, etc., suggests that there are these perceptually available cues that signal functors. And so even newborns, and this is what Rushen and Janet showed, newborns are able to perceive the phonological minimality of functors. So across the languages of the world, functors are shorter, less stressed, have simpler syllable structures, etc. So they are phonologically different. This is something that even newborn infants can pick up on. They are more frequent. There are a few other features they have that at the perceptual level already discriminate them from content words. And so you're perfectly right. They are made in such a way that they sort of look out for these cues, and then they put them together and say, okay, this word is short, it's frequent, it doesn't carry stress, etc., etc. I'll just treat it as a functor. Of course, this presupposes that they have some kind of notion of functors or content words. So the signal is rich, but as I was trying to say to Alessandro as well, to my mind, that doesn't, get rid of the poverty of the stimulus problem. Rather, the two things need to work together. So they can pick up on whatever cues they are, because indeed they have some kind of sensitivity or expectation or whatever you want to call it, that there will be some cues. So yes.
So I did an artificial language learning experiment several years ago now, in which the title of the paper was Anchor Points in Language Learning. And it was a very simple language that had what I was taking to be functors and what I was taking to be content words. And it had an A-B sort of structure, actually A-B-C-D structure, where there could be a lot of...
There's a signal problem. Turn off your image.
One
Virginia.
functor type, two functor types. Very big. Oh gosh, okay. I'm gonna go to my office after this. The idea was that people would use those small words as anchor points for doing distributional learning. So that's where I think what happens at the infancy level can connect with what happens when you're starting to learn language. You can use it to learn dependencies, but interestingly, it does seem to be dependent on the function word being much, much, much more frequent than the content word that follows it. If it's not, you don't get the dependency relation. All you get is a short, long pattern, but not that there are two different kinds of content words. So I think it's an interesting possible overlap in terms of how the initial division will map onto later distributional analysis.
Perfectly right. So I actually do cite your paper, that paper everywhere. I fully agree with you. And we even tried in infants. And so in this artificial grammar that works well, we have a ratio of 1 to 9. We took it down to 1 to 3 and it fails. It doesn't work. So with the exact same, so I completely agree with you. And we just never bothered to actually identify the point somewhere between 3 and 9 where it breaks down. And I guess the same holds for prosody. So they need to be minimal in certain ways, etc. So I fully agree with you. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, now we can hear directly from Rushen Shi.
Yes.
Rushen, go ahead. Sick. I don't know if the sound is bad. Rushen, can you turn on your sound?
Yes, I'm on.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? The connection doesn't seem to be too good. I hope we're not cut off. Judith, I really want to tell you how much I appreciate your talk. It's really important work and explaining so much about early development. I have a question. for you, and Virginia can also think about it. I think it's for both of you. How do we define even poverty of stimuli? It's something I've been thinking about. Linguists talk about it in one way, but psychologists think about it in other way. We could think about the poorness of input. We could talk about noisy input in some ways, input that are noisy in the sense not like environmental noise, but the cues that are not perfect or in contradicting mode. So I remember, Judith, you did some work where you had prosodic cues pitting against one another to see which one was more prominent. I think you did that work with Jana Worker at some point. And I'm wondering, the babies are really amazing, even at birth. They are showing these parsing, phrasal parsing based on prosody or frequency that we can assume it's perfect in the input, but we know it's probably not. Like prosody, you have some prominence in one way or another for these dimensions, but due to other things like focus, right, lexical level, then you don't get, even in corpus study, you don't get 100%, say, strong, weak, intensity or short, long, always. There will be some kind of probabilistic support, right? But when you test the babies, either neurologically or perceptually, you know, looking time, you get these final output. That's right? So I wonder, maybe you can tell us, all these students, about your work with where the prosody or the cues are in conflicting, right? And whether bilinguals, monolinguals, how they dealt with it, probabilistic, for example, and whether you've shown this neurologically, because I know you did behavioral work that worked on that, and how that largely can speak into this poverty of stimuli issue. And maybe Virginia later can also comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. This is, of course, a very difficult question, so I'll be able to answer parts of it. Okay, so essentially, just to start off with the big question, to me, the poverty of stimulus argument is not so much about noise, but about what's lacking, what's not there in the input. So I think these are two different issues. One is indeed that we make mistakes, we sometimes say ungrammatical things, or we are not native speakers, or, you know, we have a flu and so our phonemes are off. That's one thing. The other is, I think that even if everything is perfect, so you're, you know, perfectly trained radio announcer and you say everything as it should be, it's written in the big book, etc., the input still lacks explicit notions about its underlying structure. So nothing really ever says this is a predicate, this is a subject, this is a noun, this is a verb. And so to me, that's that. But I completely agree with you that even if you just consider a noise, it is a problem, because when you don't know anything, you're an infant, then how do you know what to rely on? And so I agree with you, it's probabilistic, and it's not always correct, right? So we know that infants missegment language, for example. So say in a language like Italian, you have a word, you have gender, male, female, and so you have a word like la radio, so radio, right? It ends in an O, so it should be masculine, but it's actually feminine because it's a cutoff of a longer word. And so this is often missegmented as L apostrophe a radio, for example, because then the ending, which suggests masculine, matches up with the article. So children do make mistakes. And so these are heuristic tools. So I fully agree with you, it's probabilistic. At the same time, for prosody, so this is not my work, and then I will answer you about the question you asked about my work.
Judith, just 1 second.
Yeah.
In order to be able to extend this, est-ce que c'est possible de distribuer les lunchs déjà, comme ça on peut continuer un peu? Okay, so go ahead. There's several questions.
Yeah, okay, so I'll be fast. So essentially, Marina Nespor has work suggesting that when you hear a totally unfamiliar language, at least as an adult, where we can ask you, you're given a text with no punctuation, no spaces, just the phonemes written down of a totally unfamiliar language, and you're asked to just simply mark where you hear prominence. You're not told whether it's prosodic, lexical, nothing. You're just like, whatever is prominent, tick. Then people tend to go with prosodic prominence, so phrasal prosodic prominence. So that seems to be kind of what you hear first, let's say. And so what we did with Janet was to use this paradigm, use the prosody, but in monolingual English infants. So they have a functor initial language and a duration-based VO prosody. And we gave them Japanese-like prosody. So the question was whether we can push them all the way to now rely on prosody as if that was Japanese. And at 8 months, they no longer do it. So they're kind of halfway. They don't show an English-like word order preference, but they also don't show a Japanese-like preference. They just stop showing preference. So it looks like by that age, they have a stable enough representation such that they hear that the cue is not what it should be, but it doesn't allow them to go. So essentially at some point, I should run that study with say 4 or 5 month olds to see if at that age, they're still open to both cues.
Friedemann is next. And Steve Hansen is last, and then I really will let people, probably everybody else.
Sure.
Yeah, just to, I hope you can hear me. Just to bring back the discussion to a very central point. Thanks also for the great talk. There is, you have been arguing that in neural networks, it's hard to imagine that those would change over time, so to speak, and would actually adapt to various inputs, or actually would indeed process the input in different ways at different stages. But exactly this point has been made in the neural network literature. For example, the famous paper by Ellman in 1993 in Cognition made exactly that point. It said the subtitle was "The Importance of Starting Small." Now the precise argument he has been making then had been attacked, and I'm not sure whether it's still convincing to everybody. But the general idea that the resource restrictions actually and focus on just one aspect or a small aspect of the input might actually be helpful is I think something we can nicely model in neural networks and develop explanations on that basis, especially if we go into a neural network that is brain-like, and in this case you could actually make a very strong point that a standard neural network would probably never be able to explain these differential preferences for long last, but high initial and loud more loudly initially. This as the most salient part. So that needs a neuronal explanation and inborn material.
I fully agree with you. Thank you. Indeed, you're right. So Alman's original suggestions, but I don't know whether one would make this claim for large language models, because the emphasis seems so much to be on large in every way possible that I don't know. But yes, of course, yes, you're right completely.
In this case, your message is very strong. Large language models still have a lot to learn.
Yes.
Okay, I don't see Steve. Ernest Kukum, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I'm going to ask my question in French because I know that you can answer in French, and but you can answer in French or in English, so no problem. Merci Judith pour la présentation. J'ai beaucoup apprécié. Et ma question, en fait, je ne sais pas si ça va en droite ligne avec votre recherche, ça concerne l'intonation. Est-ce que l'apprentissage des enfants pour une langue et aussi l'intonation, est-ce que votre recherche touche l'intonation dans le sens que, par exemple, Alexandro, là, quand il parlait tout à l'heure, on savait que c'était un latino qui parlait l'anglais, là. Ben vous, on ne le sait pas, je ne sais pas comment vous faites pour qu'on puisse savoir, on ne voit pas l'intonation, mais un autre exemple, c'est quand un Québécois parle français, par exemple, là, on sait que c'est un Québécois. Donc, il y a quelque chose qui ressort avant la langue même. Donc, est-ce que dans l'apprentissage infantile, effectivement, c'est d'abord cette intonation qui est ancrée avant que la syntaxe et la sémantique prennent le dessus après?
Eh bien, question posée, vas-y.
Ouais, donc je réponds en français puis en anglais. Donc disons que, alors c'est tout à fait ça. Donc c'est exactement ce que je cherche à montrer, à démontrer. Donc c'est-à-dire que l'expérience prénatale, c'est la prosodie, donc l'intonation et la rythmicité. Et donc c'est exactement ça, c'est-à-dire que cette expérience prénatale sert de point de départ avant même que les bébés puissent comprendre quoi que ce soit. Donc, du coup, justement, c'est l'intonation qui va organiser le flux de la parole en unité pour les tout petits à la naissance et pour quelques mois, je dirais. So, yes, so essentially, the question was whether intonation plays a role. And so essentially, what I am trying to argue for is exactly that. That prenatal experience is mostly prosodic, so intonation and rhythm, and it really serves as the foundation, or it lays the groundwork for further language acquisition. So it's very important, and before infants start to be able to extract words, semantics, syntax, or anything, it really is prosody as kind of the packaging in which speech comes that plays a role. So yes, completely.
Okay, Steve, if it's very, very short, make it say it, but otherwise we have to stop for lunch. I take it that we're stopping for lunch. Okay, thank you ever so much, Judith, and I hope you'll be around still today.
Yep. Yes. I'll be looking forward to listening to and discussing Virginia's talk. So yes, and the panel, of course. Thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot. Enjoy your lunch.
Stephen, I don't know whether the problem is at my end or your end. If it's at my end, I'm going to travel now to my office where I know